I still remember the smell of wet steel that morning, November 12, 1942, hanging thick over Richmond, California. The fog off San Francisco Bay mixed with the smoke from 1,000 torches until the air itself shimmered like a curtain of molten glass. Somewhere in that haze, the SS Robert E Peary, 441 feet of welded metal, stood waiting to slide into the water. A complete Liberty ship, built in just 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. Even now, writing these words decades later, it feels impossible. And yet, I watched it happen. The crowd stretched from the dry dock rails to the edge of the bay. Officials, journalists, shipwrights from rival yards who had come to witness either genius or disaster. They murmured like churchgoers before a miracle. Many of them were praying the ship would crack apart before it floated, so the old ways could stay unchallenged a little longer. I could almost hear their thoughts. A ship in 4 days? Foolishness. But the welders beside me, women with soot-dark faces, farmhands turned mechanics, clerks who'd traded typewriters for torches, stood in quiet pride. Their gloves were scorched, their backs stiff from shifts that never ended, yet their eyes glowed with something fierce. They had done the impossible, and they knew it. When the gates opened and the Peary began to slide, a hush swept through the yard. The hull groaned like some ancient creature waking, then plunged into the gray water with a thunder that rolled across the bay. Spray exploded upward, drenching the crowd. For a heartbeat, none of us breathed. Then, as the ship righted itself and floated clean, the silence broke into wild cheers. I looked at Henry Kaiser, the man everyone had mocked as a dreamer, and saw his hands trembling not with fear, but with vindication. His face was pale beneath the brim of his hard hat, but his eyes burned like furnace fire. He whispered something I barely heard over the roar. They said 6 months. We did it in 4 days. That moment, the old world of shipbuilding ended. 2 years earlier, in December 1940, Kaiser had been just a dam builder, a man who moved earth and poured concrete across the American West. He'd built the Hoover and the Bonneville, monuments of steel and water, but never a single ship. When he signed his first contract with the United States Maritime Commission to build 30 cargo vessels for Britain, the veterans of the Todd Bath Iron Works laughed behind closed doors. They called him the Concrete Cowboy. One newspaper headline sneered, "Highways, not harbors. Kaiser plays at shipbuilding." I wasn't laughing. I had seen the man's restlessness up close. He hated the word impossible. It was like a match to gasoline. When he walked the empty mudflats of Richmond for the first time, boots sinking into black clay, the wind carrying the cries of gulls, he pointed to the horizon and said, "This is where we'll build faster than they can sink them." We thought he was speaking metaphorically. He wasn't. The world in those days was bleeding. German U-boats hunted Allied convoys like wolves. Britain was starving, and the Atlantic was a graveyard of steel. American shipyards, bound by centuries of tradition, could take 230 days to finish a single freighter. The math was terrifying. The enemy sank ships faster than we could replace them. Every cargo lost meant fewer tanks, fewer bullets, fewer chances of survival. Kaiser looked at that arithmetic and refused to accept it. "We don't need more heroes," he told his engineers. "We need more ships. Heroes can't win wars without cargo." So he started tearing up the rulebook. He had never built a ship, but he knew how to build systems. The first time I saw his blueprints for the Richmond yard, I thought he was designing a dream too big for the earth to hold 7 parallel building ways, massive cranes spaced every 100 feet, railway lines crisscrossing like veins. Where traditional yards raised cathedrals to craftsmanship, Kaiser built a factory for speed. At night he would walk the half-finished site, coat collar turned up against the wind, talking quietly to himself. "It's all just assembly," he would mutter. "Same as cars, only bigger." His chief engineer, Clay Bedford, had just returned from Detroit, where he'd watched Ford's assembly lines. Cars slid past workers who installed the same parts again and again with mechanical rhythm. Bedford told Kaiser, "Why can't we do that with ships?" And Kaiser had smiled that slow, dangerous smile that meant he'd already decided to try. He proposed something the naval establishment considered sacrilege: electric arc welding instead of riveting. Rivets were tradition hot iron pins driven through overlapping steel plates, 1,000,000 per ship, each hammered by skilled teams working in perfect rhythm. Welding, by contrast, was quick, ugly, and unproven. The British Navy had banned it on warships. Vice Admiral Emery Land nearly threw the proposal off his desk. "We can't gamble America's supply lines on pipe dream metallurgy," he said, "but desperation has a way of bending doctrine. German torpedoes didn't wait for committees." So the gamble was taken. By the spring of 1941, Richmond was rising like some mechanical organism out of the mud sparks flashing from new cranes, diesel engines roaring as foundations hardened. It looked nothing like a shipyard. It looked like an enormous experiment in motion. Traditional builders came to inspect it and left shaking their heads. "Too big," they said. "Too fast. Too reckless." One wrote that Kaiser's design violated every principle of efficient shipyard layout. He was right, and that was precisely why it worked. Soon, buses arrived filled with people who had never seen the ocean: secretaries, farmers, housewives. They came for a chance at work and found themselves turned into welders in just 2 weeks. The training school smelled of ozone and ambition. Instructors barked out techniques for vertical seams and deck joints. Sparks showered from test plates as if fireworks were exploding indoors. No one cared about elegance, only speed, strength, and repetition. Kaiser's genius wasn't in knowing the craft, it was in simplifying it. He broke complex art into steps anyone could learn. I remember one woman, a mother of 2 from Oklahoma, lowering her mask for the first time after finishing a perfect bead. Her eyes gleamed through soot. "Didn't think I could do that," she said softly. That was the heart of it: belief. The shipyards weren't just building ships, they were building faith in what ordinary people could do. When I think back to that November day in 1942, the roar of the Robert E Peary sliding into the bay still echoes in my chest. Kaiser stood apart from the applause, his face unreadable. For him, this wasn't victory. It was proof that the old limits had been illusions all along. The reporters shouted his name, asking how he'd done it, what secret made it possible. He simply said, "We stopped asking permission from the past." That night, as the ship's wake spread across the dark water, the floodlights of Richmond reflected off the surface like 1,000 tiny suns. Somewhere out there, men were still dying in the Atlantic. But now, the equation had changed. For the first time, the ocean had more ships being born than sunk. And though no one knew it yet, this miracle of steel and sweat would do more than win a war. It would rewrite how the modern world built everything thereafter. The first time I saw Henry Kaiser face the shipbuilding establishment, it felt like watching a lone miner walk into a cathedral of marble and mirrors. The old shipbuilders sat behind polished tables in Washington, their suits immaculate, their faces carved from the same stone as the monuments outside. They spoke in the heavy, measured tones of men, certain the world worked only one way, their way. Kaiser, by contrast, wore the dust of the West on his coat and a smile that seemed too casual for the room. He didn't look like a naval architect. He looked like a man who'd come straight from a construction site, which, in truth, he had. When one of the committee members cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Kaiser, this is shipbuilding, not dam construction," the room chuckled. Kaiser didn't. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, and said quietly, "Gentlemen, you've been building ships for centuries. The world doesn't have centuries anymore." That silence afterward was the moment the revolution began. To understand how mad his idea sounded, you need to remember what shipbuilding was in 1941. It was a religion, precise, slow, sacred. Rivets were hammered by crews who could trace their craft back generations. Shipwrights used patterns passed from fathers to sons like Holy Scripture. Every plate was cut by hand, every seam was measured twice and riveted once. A good freighter took 6 to 8 months, a masterpiece of discipline and patience. And then Kaiser walked in and said, "We'll do it in weeks." He had no shipyard, no shipwrights, and no reason to be believed. Yet something about the desperation of the times gave his words a strange weight. German submarines were sinking Allied ships faster than they could be, replaced 3.6 million tons lost in 1941 alone. London rationed food, the Atlantic became a graveyard, and every convoy that didn't arrive meant another family starved. America hadn't yet entered the war, but everyone knew it was coming. And when it did, logistics would decide the outcome. The Navy didn't trust him, but they needed him. That's often how change begins, not through faith, but through necessity. The turning point came with Clay Bedford, Kaiser's chief engineer, a quiet man with grease under his nails and a mechanic's instinct for how things move. He'd just returned from Detroit, where he'd studied the Ford Motor Company's assembly lines. In the hum of conveyor belts and the rhythm of moving chassis, he saw a new kind of order. Instead of one team building an entire car, dozens of teams built small, repeatable sections that came together like clockwork. When he told Kaiser what he'd seen, Henry's eyes lit up. "We can do that," he said, not as a question but as a decision. "We'll build ships like cars." Bedford hesitated. "They'll laugh us out of every shipyard in the country." "They already are," Kaiser replied, "so we might as well give them something worth laughing about." That night, the two men sat over a blueprint table in a dim office, sketching what would become the first modular shipyard design in history. They drew broad open spaces where sections of ships, the bow, the stern, the cargo holds, could be built separately, welded in parallel, and then assembled like the parts of a machine. Each section would move by rail on massive dollies. Each weld would replace hundreds of rivets, and each worker would specialize in one simple motion, repeated to perfection. It wasn't shipbuilding, it was industrial choreography. But their ideas collided headfirst with the old guard. Vice Admiral Emory Land, chairman of the Maritime Commission, reviewed Kaiser's plans and shook his head. "This isn't ship construction," he said flatly. "It's a gamble with the Atlantic supply line." In the official correspondence later archived in Washington, Land wrote, "Welding has never been proven reliable for hull construction at this scale. The British forbid it. Kaiser is proposing we bet the war on an experiment." Yet the admiral also understood desperation. Every report crossing his desk spoke of convoys lost, of lifeboats drifting cold and empty. Britain was begging for ships. The United States couldn't afford to wait. So Land approved the contract not because he believed, but because he had no choice. When Kaiser received the news, he didn't celebrate. He simply nodded and said, "Then we'd better not fail." The first months were chaos. The Richmond yard, still rising from the mud, looked more like a battlefield than a factory. Cement trucks roared night and day. The sparks from new cranes lit up the fog like lightning. Bedford walked the site with a clipboard, shouting over the noise, assigning zones for prefabrication. The smell of burnt metal mixed with salt and diesel. Nobody knew yet if this would work, but everyone sensed they were standing at the edge of something irreversible. Traditional shipbuilders visited and scoffed. One veteran from Bethlehem Steel remarked, "He's building a circus, not a shipyard." Yet even as they laughed, something about the scale of it unnerved them. The cranes loomed higher than any they'd seen. The tracks crisscrossing the ground promised motion on a scale the old yards couldn't imagine. Kaiser ignored their doubts. He was too busy recruiting. He sent out newspaper ads across the country. No experience necessary. Training provided. Help build ships for victory. Within weeks, they came in droves. Farmers from the Dust Bowl, secretaries from the Midwest, men too old for combat, and women too stubborn to stay idle. They poured into Richmond by train and bus, and Kaiser's people found ways to house them all tents first, then hastily built dormitories. The shipyard became a city unto itself, pulsing with urgency. The training schools were like boot camps for steel. Recruits learned to weld in 2 weeks. The instructors barked commands over the sizzle of torches. Hold the arc steady, keep your bead clean, don't flinch from the heat. Hands that had once written letters or harvested wheat now fused plates of armor with liquid fire. When they lifted their helmets, their faces were blackened, their eyes bright. Kaiser walked among them often, greeting each with a nod, memorizing names, sometimes stopping to ask, "Do you believe in what we're doing here?" Some said yes, others shrugged, but all of them kept welding. By the end of 1941, something extraordinary began to happen. The impossible started to look routine. The first ship took 197 days, respectable but unremarkable. The second, 169 days. The fifth, 128. The 10th, 97. By spring 1942, Richmond's Liberty ships were launching in 70 days, faster than anyone had believed possible. Traditional shipyards scoffed that Kaiser's ships wouldn't hold up at sea. They called them welded coffins. But when the first few crossed the Atlantic intact, hauling tanks, food, and fuel, the laughter quieted. Even the skeptics began sending spies, engineers, posing as visitors to understand how untrained workers were outpacing master craftsmen. I remember one evening, a veteran shipwright from the East Coast stood beside me, watching a Liberty ship's bow section lifted into place by a 150-ton crane. "This isn't shipbuilding," he muttered bitterly. I expected contempt in his tone. But when the massive steel curved into position, perfectly aligned, I heard something else in his voice, awe. Kaiser's success wasn't luck. It was faith, strategy, and defiance welded together by necessity. He believed the world was built on processes, not pedigree. He believed that complexity wasn't a badge of honor, but a weakness, and he believed that the only true expertise was the courage to start again from zero. He wasn't trying to prove the experts wrong, he simply refused to accept that they were right. In early 1942, when the Robert E. Peary was still just a dream in steel plates stacked by the docks, Kaiser looked out across his humming yard and said quietly, "Someday they'll understand the ships aren't our greatest creation. The people are." I didn't understand what he meant then. I do now. Because the miracle of the Liberty ships wasn't just that they floated. It was that they rose out of mud, out of doubt, out of centuries of fear disguised as tradition. When I close my eyes, I can still see the Richmond yard as it looked in those first months of 1942. Not the proud monument it later became, but a raw, churning landscape of noise and sparks and mud. The air was alive with sound, the screech of cranes, the clatter of steel on steel, the rhythmic hiss of welding torches carving light into darkness. To most outsiders, it looked like chaos. To Henry Kaiser, it was a new kind of order being born, forged from confusion, driven by urgency, and carried on the backs of ordinary people who had never built anything bigger than their own dreams. The mudflats where the yard stood had once been a forgotten edge of California, a stretch of tide-churned marshes that smelled of salt and decay. Yet by mid-1941, they pulsed with electricity. Every dawn, the whistle blew, and a river of workers flowed through the gates, men and women from every corner of the country, drawn by the promise of steady pay and purpose. They came with calloused hands and cautious hearts. Dust Bowl farmers, factory clerks, miners, widows, even teenagers who'd lied about their age to get hired. They weren't shipwrights, but they were hungry, and Kaiser knew hunger could build faster than tradition ever could. He often stood on the raised platform above the assemblyways, watching them swarm like ants over steel plates the size of houses. "They think I'm building ships," he murmured to his son Edgar one morning. "But what I'm really building is faith." Edgar nodded, though at the time neither of us fully understood what he meant. The genius of Kaiser's revolution lay not just in his machines or his cranes, but in how he simplified everything. Where old shipyards prized mastery, he prized motion. Tasks were stripped to their essence. One worker welded vertical seams, another only deck joints, another curved hull plates. It was the death of the apprentice system and the birth of industrial democracy. Every motion was practiced until it became instinct. 2 weeks of training could create a specialist. 4 could create a leader. Inside the training sheds, the air shimmered with heat. I remember walking past rows of new welders, faces hidden behind helmets, their arcs spraying gold sparks like fireflies. The instructor, a wiry man with a voice like gravel, barked over the crackle, "Don't think, just weld. The ship doesn't care about your doubts." Some of the women flinched at first, but by the second week they didn't even blink at the flying sparks. When they lifted their masks, their cheeks were smudged black, their eyes bright with pride. One of them, her name was Eleanor, caught me watching. She lowered her helmet and shouted through the noise, "Sir, I was a school teacher last month. Now I build ships." She laughed, the sound fierce and free. I nodded back, unable to find words. In her voice was the entire meaning of the revolution. By the spring of 1942, the transformation was visible not just in the people, but in the skyline. The 7 parallel building ways stretched toward the bay like fingers of steel. Each was flanked by prefabrication areas where enormous sections of ships, the bow, stern, deck houses, were built simultaneously. Overhead cranes rolled on rails, able to lift entire sections weighing 150 tons. The ground trembled when they moved. Traditional engineers called it madness. "The prefabrication areas are too large," wrote John Riley of Bethlehem Steel in a confidential report. "The crane capacity is absurd. The building ways are too short," he concluded reluctantly. And yet, somehow, it works. It worked because Kaiser refused to let old logic dictate new needs. Ships were no longer built in sequence, keel to hull, hull to deck, deck to engine. They were built in parallel, as if the entire yard were a living organism, every cell moving independently but toward the same goal. The bow might be welded in one corner, the stern in another, and the engine assembled in a separate shop. Then, when each was ready, the cranes would lower the completed parts into place like organs fitted into a body. Watching it come together was like witnessing an orchestra without a conductor somehow play a perfect symphony. We began keeping track of the numbers because even we could hardly believe them. The first ship had taken 197 days, then 169, then 128. Soon it was 97, then 70. At each milestone, Kaiser would gather us at dawn near the launchway, the air sharp with fog, and say the same words, "If we can build one in 70 days, we can build one in 50. If we can build one in 50, we can build one in 30. He never raised his voice. He didn't have to. His certainty filled the space louder than any speech. Even Vice Admiral Howard Vickery, who'd once mocked Kaiser's assembly line nonsense, began to change his tune. In a March 1942 memo, he admitted, "Perfection is the enemy of sufficient." It was the closest thing to an apology we ever got. The ships weren't elegant. They weren't meant to be. Their hulls bore the scars of rushed welds and hastily cut plates. But they floated. They carried food to Britain, tanks to Africa, and hope across an ocean of fire, and each one was built faster, cheaper, and stronger than the last. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Riveters from the old yards sneered that our ships were tin cans. Traditional foremen said welded hulls would split like eggshells. Once, during a storm, one of the Liberty ships cracked down the middle. While unloading in New York, the newspapers pounced Kaiser's "Welding fails at sea." For a week, the headlines blared doubt. Kaiser said nothing. He simply ordered his metallurgists to study the failure, changed the steel specification, and moved on. When the next ship survived a hurricane intact, the critics fell silent. He taught us something vital then. Innovation doesn't mean never failing. It means refusing to stop when you do. By the summer of 1942, the Richmond yard had become a city of its own. Cafeterias served 20,000 meals a day. The night shifts glowed under floodlights so bright you could read a newspaper from the far fence. Children played in makeshift housing projects nearby, their mothers welding just beyond the wall. In the evenings, the bay shimmered with the reflections of ships waiting for launch, dark silhouettes of triumph against a horizon still at war. There was exhaustion, of course. Tempers flared, accidents happened, men collapsed from heat or strain, but there was also something else, a quiet pride that hummed beneath the fatigue. We weren't just building ships anymore, we were proving that the impossible could be systemized. One night, I walked along the assemblyways after the shifts had ended. The cranes stood motionless in the moonlight, their shadows stretched across the deck plates like the ribs of some sleeping giant. I could still smell the sharp tang of molten steel cooling in the dark. I thought of the thousands of hands that had touched each plate, untrained hands, trembling at first, then sure. Somewhere in the distance, a lone welder's torch still flickered, finishing a seam long after the bell had rung. The sight filled me with something close to reverence. When the Joseph N. Teal launched from our Oregon yard in just 10 days that September, we cheered until our throats went raw. It wasn't just a record, it was proof that the tide had turned. What had begun as a desperate experiment on a patch of California mud had become a national movement. Other yards were copying us now. Even the doubters were calling for our blueprints. And yet, Kaiser wasn't satisfied. Standing before the latest ship gleaming in the floodlights, he turned to Bedford and said, "10 days is still too slow." Bedford laughed. "What's next, Henry? 4?" Kaiser didn't answer, but the way he smiled told me everything. In his mind, the next revolution had already begun. I will never forget the autumn of 1942, those restless electric weeks when our shipyards no longer just built ships, but competed like athletes chasing a record that no one had believed possible. The sky above Richmond and Portland flickered with the glow of welding arcs through the night, each one burning like a heartbeat of war. What began as efficiency became obsession. Kaiser's two great teams, Richmond Yard No. 2 under Clay Bedford and Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation under Edgar Kaiser, had turned shipbuilding into a race against time itself. The newspapers called it the Liberty Ship Derby. Headlines read like sports scores. Oregon Yard's launch in 10 days, Richmond vows to beat it. Even Vice Admiral Vickery, who once despised the chaos of these experiments, confessed in private, "The competition may be madness, but it's the kind of madness that wins wars." Inside the yard, that madness felt holy. Every clang of steel was a note in a hymn to speed. The workers no longer walked, they ran. Schedules were rewritten hourly, welders shifted in overlapping patterns, and supervisors mapped progress on chalkboards as if tracking the pulse of a living creature. To an outsider, it looked frantic. To us, it was rhythm. I remember Bedford pacing the catwalk at dawn, his coat flapping in the sea wind. He'd been awake for 30 hours straight, yet his voice still carried over the din. "We're not fighting the Germans," he shouted. "We're fighting the calendar." And in some way, he was right. Every day we gained meant lives saved in the Atlantic. Every ship that sailed meant another convoy fed, another nation kept alive. Still, there was tension in the air, a kind of fever. The older welders, those who had come from traditional yards back east, grumbled that it had gone too far. "Ships aren't sausages," one muttered, watching a 150-ton stern section swing into place like a toy under the crane's hook. But when that section fit perfectly, sealing a week's worth of work in a single drop. Even he fell silent. I learned then that disbelief has a sound. It's the hush that follows undeniable proof. The Joseph N. Teal set the first great record that September, 10 days from keel to launch. The press flooded the yard, and photographers captured the moment the ship hit the water. The cheers rose like thunder. That night, Kaiser called both Bedford and Edgar into his office. He didn't congratulate them. He simply leaned forward, eyes glittering, and said, "Now cut it in half." Even they laughed at first. "Henry, 10 days is already beyond reason," Bedford protested. Kaiser only replied, "Reason built 6-month ships. I build ships in days." It was reckless, absurd, and perfectly in character. Vice Admiral Land, visiting Richmond soon after, made a remark to a group of journalists. Impressive progress, though still far slower than mass production in other industries. He didn't mean it as a challenge, but Bedford took it as one. Within an hour he'd stormed into the planning office, slammed his hand on the table, and announced, "We'll build one in less than 5 days. We'll make him eat those words." The room went silent. Someone whispered, "Impossible." Bedford smiled thinly. "Then it's worth doing." The 47th hull was chosen for the attempt, a Liberty ship, to be named SS Robert E Peary, after the Arctic explorer who had conquered impossible ice. It felt fitting. On November 8, 1942, just 1 minute past midnight, the first sparks flew from the keel plates. Over 1,000 workers took their positions under the glare of floodlights that turned night into day. The scene was almost otherworldly. Cranes loomed like giants in the fog, welders' masks glowed blue, and the smell of ozone and oil thickened the air until it tasted metallic. Every hour mattered. The entire yard moved as one body. Prefabricated sections, bow, stern, cargo holds, deck houses had been built in advance, inspected, and staged in neat rows like soldiers waiting for command. The engine, a 140-ton triple expansion steam plant, had already been assembled and tested in Sunnyvale before being mounted onto its foundation frame. Nothing was left to chance. When the keel touched the ways, the ship was already half-born. Kaiser visited at dawn on the second day. His coat was soaked with mist, his shoes caked in dust, but his expression was calm. "How's she holding?" he asked Bedford. The engineer didn't look up from his clipboard. "Ahead of schedule," Kaiser nodded, staring out at the hull, glowing under 1,000 sparks. "Then keep her breathing," he said softly, as if the ship were alive. I kept a small notebook during those days, notes, sketches, little details I didn't want to forget. On the third night, the rain came hard, drumming on the metal roof of the fabrication shed like artillery fire. But no one stopped. The welders pulled canvas over their stations, torches hissing against the downpour. Somewhere near midnight, one of them, a boy barely 20, looked at me and grinned through the soot. "She'll float, sir. You'll see." By the morning of the fourth day, the hull was complete. The cranes moved in perfect harmony, lowering deckhouses and cargo sections into place with the grace of ballet dancers. The workers, hollow-eyed from exhaustion, moved wordlessly, as if fear itself had burned away. When the last weld cooled, someone yelled, "Engine ready!" and the great power plant was lowered into the waiting hull. Bedford checked his watch. 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes, he said. Then, turning to Kaiser, "She's ready to launch." The ceremony that followed was small at first, almost private, but word spread like wildfire. By the time the gates opened, thousands had gathered: naval officers, reporters, rival shipbuilders, curious citizens. Many expected failure. They thought the Peary would slide into the water and sink, a hollow shell rushed beyond reason. I can still see the tension in Kaiser's jaw as he watched the final preparations. For once, he said nothing. The whistles blew. The blocks were pulled. The ship began to move. The Peary slid down the greased ways faster than anyone expected, cutting through the mist with a sound like thunder rolling across the bay. The crowd gasped as she hit the water. Then a collective cheer erupted when she leveled, steady and proud. In that instant, every doubt, every sneer, every whispered insult against Kaiser's madness drowned beneath the roar of victory. Admiral Land himself was there. When reporters asked for his thoughts, he hesitated, eyes fixed on the ship gliding across the bay. Then he said, quietly, 6 months ago I'd have called this impossible. Henry Kaiser has made the impossible obsolete. That night, when the lights dimmed and the crowd was gone, I walked alone along the silent rails. The smell of burnt oil still hung in the air, mingled with the faint sweetness of the bay. The ship's hull gleamed under the moonlight, a silver giant born in less than 5 days. Somewhere behind me, the cranes creaked as the wind shifted, and I thought of all the hands that had touched that steel, all the eyes that had refused to look away when others said it couldn't be done. For the first time, I understood what Kaiser had meant when he said he was building faith. The Robert E Peary was more than a ship. It was proof that the old gods of tradition could bleed, and that ordinary people could perform miracles if someone simply believed they could. The headlines the next morning called it the miracle of Richmond. But for us who lived it, there was no miracle, only work, courage, and a man who had refused to be told no. And as I looked across the bay, where the Peary steamed toward the horizon, I knew something the newspapers did not. This was not the end of the race. It was only the beginning of a revolution that would change not just shipbuilding, but the very idea of what human hands could create when time itself became the enemy. By the spring of 1943, the shipyards no longer sounded like chaos. They breathed. The clang of hammers and the hiss of welding torches had found their rhythm, a pulse that carried across Richmond's fog-draped bay like a heartbeat of steel. Every launch was still a spectacle, but by then, the impossible had become ordinary. Ships that once took half a year now rose from nothing in weeks. And behind every one of those hulls stood an army of workers who, 2 years earlier, the world would never have trusted with such work. They called them Kaiser's people. I called them something else, America's new engineers. The transformation began quietly, not with fanfare, but with faces the women who arrived each dawn, hair tied back under scarves, coveralls streaked with soot, their eyes bright with purpose. They were stenographers yesterday, mothers last month, and welders today. They came because the war had emptied the factories of men. They stayed because, for the first time, someone told them they were capable of more than anyone had ever allowed them to believe. Kaiser's ads had been blunt. No experience necessary, training provided, good pay. But the unspoken promise was more powerful. You belong here. By mid-1943, over 40,000 women worked in his yards. They called themselves Wendy the Welders, half in jest, half in pride. I remember walking past one of the training sheds and hearing a young instructor bark over the roar of torches, "Ladies, this isn't sewing, this is saving lives." And they believed him. The women learned fast. Some of them developed reputations for flawless seams. Others could outpace any man on deck assembly. When one supervisor questioned a female welder's precision, she handed him a finished joint that looked like a silver river and said, "Check it yourself, boss. It won't leak." He never questioned her again. And it wasn't only women. Kaiser opened his gates to everyone America had left on the margins. African Americans, Mexican immigrants, older men, the disabled, the untrained, the unseen. He didn't care about their backgrounds. He cared only about their willingness to learn. By 1944, more than 30,000 black men and women worked in his yards, not sweeping floors but welding, fitting, driving cranes, even supervising. In an era when segregation ruled the nation, Kaiser's shipyards stood as an unspoken rebellion. It wasn't perfect. Prejudice crept through the gates like fog, whispered insults, unfair shifts, quiet resentment. But Kaiser confronted it in the only way he knew how, through opportunity. Judge by output, he told his managers, not by color. Some of the best welders in Richmond were black. I remember one named Joseph Carter. Tall, quiet, hands steady as rock. He used to say, "The steel doesn't care who melts it, only that it holds." His words carried more truth than any speech I ever heard. The work itself was punishing. The torches spat heat like small suns. The cranes groaned under the weight of cargo holds. The smell of oil and burnt metal clung to skin and lungs alike, yet morale never broke. Kaiser understood that workers needed more than pay. They needed dignity. So he gave it to them in ways that startled traditionalists. There were cafeterias serving full meals for pennies, medical stations open around the clock, and a daycare center so mothers could weld while their children played safely nearby. He even brought in doctors and set up a new system of prepaid health care. A strange idea then, but one that would outlive the war. We didn't know it at the time, but we were witnessing the birth of Kaiser Permanente, born not in hospitals but in shipyards. One Christmas Eve, he did something no one expected. Most companies closed for the holiday. Kaiser didn't. He knew the war couldn't pause, yet he also knew the people needed to feel seen. That night, the cafeteria lights glowed warm through the fog as carolers from the local church sang between the cranes. Long tables were laid with roasted turkey, ham, and pies. Workers still in coveralls sat beside their children, grease-stained hands wrapped around cups of coffee. I saw Kaiser walking among them, shaking hands, thanking each one personally. "You're saving the world," he said softly to a woman welder as she wiped her child's face. She smiled, eyes shining with exhaustion and pride. I don't think anyone there realized how rare it was. A millionaire industrialist spending Christmas not in a mansion, but in a mess hall filled with laborers. But he understood something the rest of us were only learning. Loyalty isn't commanded. It's earned. By mid-1944, the scale defied imagination. The Richmond yards alone employed nearly 100,000 souls, working 3 shifts that never let the fires die. At full tilt, one ship slid down the ways every few days. Across the nation, Kaiser's methods had spread to 18 shipyards. America was launching 3 Liberty ships a day, faster than German submarines could sink them. And yet, the most astonishing numbers weren't measured in steel, but in people. The average Liberty ship required fewer than 500,000 man-hours. By 1943, less than half the labor of the first ones. Entire tasks once needing master craftsmen were now handled by trained workers with just weeks of instruction. It wasn't a loss of skill, it was the democratization of it. Kaiser's revolution had proven something that frightened old industrialists. Expertise could be taught, power could be shared. And ordinary citizens, given trust and purpose, could perform miracles once reserved for the elite. I often think back to those long nights when the yard lights reflected on the bay like stars fallen to earth. The noise never truly stopped. Even at midnight, you could hear the clang of distant hammers. Sometimes I'd walk to the edge of the dock and watch a finished ship gliding toward the open sea, her steel hull glowing faintly in the moonlight. I would think of the hands that built her, the teacher from Kansas, the miner from Kentucky, the welder from Alabama, the mother from Oregon, all strangers bound by a single rhythm of faith and urgency. Those were the moments when I understood the real miracle of Richmond. It wasn't the speed records or the statistics. It was the unity, the feeling that we were part of something vast and moral, something that transcended the boundaries of class, race, and gender. The shipyard had become a mirror of what America claimed to be but rarely was, a place where worth was measured by effort, not ancestry. Kaiser had called it industrial democracy. We didn't have the words for it back then, but we lived it every day. Years later, when I read about how historians described those shipyards, how they spoke of innovation and efficiency, I couldn't help but smile. They always mentioned the machines, the cranes, the welding torches. They rarely mentioned the people. But it was the people who were the true engines of that revolution. The sparks that flew from their torches weren't just fire. They were belief. Belief that no matter who you were or where you came from, you could help build something that would outlast you. And maybe that's what Henry Kaiser had seen all along, standing on those muddy flats back in 1940, when everyone laughed at his dream. Maybe he wasn't just imagining ships. Maybe he was imagining a new kind of nation, one that finally believed in its own hands. When the war ended in 1945, silence fell over the shipyards like an aftershock. For 4 relentless years, the clang of steel and the hiss of torches had never stopped. Now, suddenly, it did. The cranes that once swung day and night stood motionless, their cables swaying gently in the wind. The floodlights dimmed. The smell of hot metal, which had filled the bay air for half a decade, faded into salt and stillness. I walked through the Richmond yard one early morning that autumn, boots echoing on the empty steel decks where ships had once been born every few days. The rails were rusting already. The great sheds stood hollow. Only the gulls remained, circling above the silent ways. It felt as though a living organism had gone to sleep. But even in that quiet, I could sense something larger, something that would not die with the war. Henry Kaiser had always said that the ships were only half the story. The other half, he told me once, was what the world would do with what we'd learned. And he was right. When the last Liberty ship was delivered that September, Kaiser's workforce, once 200,000 strong, fell to fewer than 20,000. Men and women who had built miracles returned to their peacetime lives, but the knowledge they carried went with them. Those 2 years on the bay had changed everything, not just how ships were built, but how the modern world would think about making anything. The rest of the world noticed. In Japan, still reeling from destruction, engineers studied the records from Richmond and Portland. They saw how modular prefabrication and welding could replace centuries of craft and accelerate rebirth. In Korea, young industrialists pored over photographs of our assembly ways. They called Kaiser's process the gospel of efficiency. When the first post-war shipyards rose in Nagasaki and Ulsan, their foundations bore the unmistakable DNA of the Liberty ship program. The methods that had once horrified traditional engineers became the blueprint for a new era of global manufacturing. Prefabrication, modular design, simplified drawings, all of it echoed outward. What Kaiser had done to ships, the world soon did to cities. But it wasn't only technology that spread, it was philosophy. Kaiser had treated labor not as a tool but as an ally. His insistence that anyone could learn, that speed and precision came from trust rather than control, rewrote how industries thought about people. In the decades that followed, managers, economists, and engineers began citing the Liberty program as a case study in what they called capability building. Harvard professors analyzed it, European economists called it the Richmond effect. But for us who had lived it, it wasn't theory. It was memory, the feel of a torch handle in the palm, the weight of belief, heavy as steel. Even Kaiser's healthcare experiment, those small clinics built beside the yards, so workers could be treated without losing hours, survived the war. They became hospitals, then a system. By the 1,950 seconds, it had a name, Kaiser Permanente. Decades later, millions of Americans would use a healthcare model born out of a shipyard built on mud. In 1946, I returned to Richmond one last time before leaving for good. I found Kaiser standing by the edge of the bay, coat collar turned up against the wind. The tide was low, the mud glistened like old bronze. He was staring at the empty ways where the Robert E Peary had once stood. "They said it would all end when the war ended," he murmured, not turning to me. "But look closer. The war's finished, yes. The work that's only begun." He gestured toward the silent cranes. You see those? Every one of them changed how the world thinks. Japan will build faster because of us. Korea will. Maybe even Europe. We showed them how to make time obey. Then, quieter, he added, I just hope they remember it wasn't about the steel. I asked him what he meant. He smiled faintly. The steel carried ships, but the belief carried civilization. He was right again. By the 1960s, the very nations, once crippled by war, were building fleets that dwarfed our own faster, cheaper, stronger, using the methods Kaiser had invented out of necessity. The shipyards of Ulsan, Kobe, and Nagasaki rose like monuments to the idea that efficiency could be a form of freedom. Every massive container ship sliding into the Pacific carried a little bit of Richmond within its welded seams. Historians later called it the Kaiser chain, tracing the flow of knowledge from California's mudflats to Asia's steel coasts. The irony was that few of those workers overseas had ever heard his name. But they didn't need to. His legacy wasn't a statue. It was a method, alive, in motion. Even back home, the echoes reached beyond shipbuilding. Construction companies began borrowing our techniques. Bridges, factories, and even homes were now built in modules assembled, like our Liberty ships, piece by piece, faster than anyone thought possible. The same principle, simplify, trust, repeat, seeped into industries as far apart as electronics and oil refining. Engineers began speaking of Kaiserization, turning impossibility into process. And yet, for all the progress, the human side of the story faded too quickly. When people looked back, they saw only statistics: 2,710 Liberty ships, an average of 42 days each, 27% built by Kaiser's yards. They spoke of efficiency curves, tonnage, cost per ton. They forgot the faces that had glowed behind the welding masks, the calloused hands that had built a new world in 4 years flat. Sometimes I wondered what became of them, the women who'd gone back to quiet lives, the men who'd traded cranes for farms. I imagine they carried the same quiet pride I felt, the knowledge that they had proven something no historian could ever quite capture, that when people believe in their own capacity, the world changes shape around them. One evening, years later, I visited the SS Jeremiah O'Brien, one of the few Liberty ships still afloat. Her decks were clean, her paint fresh, but when I stepped into the engine room, I smelled the old scent of oil and heat and salt that carried me straight back to 1942. I ran my hand along the steel railing and felt the faint tremor of the ship's heartbeat, that deep, slow rhythm that meant she was alive. An old volunteer guide noticed my expression. "She's still seaworthy, you know," he said. Sailed to Normandy for the 50th anniversary of D-Day under her own power. I nodded, unable to speak. 8 decades had passed since those days in Richmond, yet the proof still floated here before me, a relic not of war, but of faith. The world often remembers Henry Kaiser as a builder of dams, of ships, of industries. But to those of us who knew him, he was something rarer, a believer in the unfinished potential of people. When he stood before those first workers, he didn't see their inexperience. He saw possibility, and that, more than any blueprint or weld, was the true innovation. He used to say, "The world moves when someone refuses to wait." Looking back now, I think that was the secret all along. We didn't wait for expertise. We didn't wait for permission. We just began, and by doing so, changed the rhythm of the century. Sometimes when I walk past modern shipyards on the Pacific coast, I still hear faint echoes of Richmond, the clang, the hum, the fire. And I remember how it felt to watch the Robert E Peary slide into the bay, the impossible made real by hands that had never known such work before. Most of the ships are gone now, rusted to dust or resting on ocean floors. But the idea that birthed them, that ordinary people, united by purpose and belief, can conquer the impossible, still sails on every vessel built since. Henry Kaiser had said that the shipyard was temporary, but what he built inside of us, that quiet conviction that nothing is truly beyond reach, endures everywhere. There's steel, courage, and a reason to begin again. The war ended, but its lessons never did. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still see the Liberty ships lined along the docks, gray against the blue haze of the Pacific, their decks alive with the clang of work, their names painted in bold white letters: Robert E. Peary, John W. Brown, Jeremiah O'Brien. Each one was a heartbeat of a vast machine that outbuilt fear itself. I did not know it then, but those steel hulls carried more than guns and cargo. They carried proof of what people could do when the word impossible lost its meaning. Decades later, long after the smoke had cleared and the welders' torches had gone cold, I read the words of Admiral Chester Nimitz in his memoir. He wrote, "We fought across 5,000 miles of the Pacific, supplied by ships built faster than the enemy could sink them. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could build 3 ships daily over the side that could sink 2. And there it was, the quiet truth at the heart of it all. Courage alone had not won the war. Faith organized into action had. The Pacific was conquered as much in the shipyards of Richmond as on the beaches of Iwo Jima. By 1944, Kaiser's empire of steel had reached its height: 7 shipyards, working around the clock, 196,000 workers united in rhythm. They weren't soldiers, but their labor was warfare of another kind, against distance, against hunger, against despair. Every Liberty ship that slid down the greased rails was another blow struck for survival. When I think of those years, I don't remember the headlines or the speeches. I remember the sound, that thunderous cheer every time a new ship touched water. It was a sound of deliverance, of ordinary people proving their worth in a world that had underestimated them. And I remember the faces: a young woman wiping her forehead, a black welder leaning on his torch, an old machinist adjusting a valve with trembling hands. They didn't know it, but they were redefining what industry meant, turning work into something almost sacred. After the war, people said the Liberty ships were crude, ugly, temporary. They called them the ugly ducklings of the sea. Maybe they were right. They were square, slow, unadorned. But they floated when it mattered. They crossed oceans while others sank. They carried food, ammunition, and hope to a starving world. And many of them kept floating long after their expected 5 years. Some carried cargo into the 1,970 seconds. A few are still here, museum ships, monuments to efficiency and courage. I once stood aboard the Jeremiah O'Brien when she returned from Normandy in 1994, 50 years after D-Day. The same decks I had seen glowing with fresh paint in 1942 now gleamed with history. I ran my hand along the rail, feeling the cool steel hum under my palm. She had outlived the war, outlived even most of us who had built her. It struck me then that was the truest victory of all. The ship we thought would last 5 years had lasted half a century. What does that say about faith turned into structure, belief turned into craft? Kaiser didn't live to see the full reach of his influence, but his fingerprints are everywhere: on the bridges of California, in the hospitals that still bear his name, in the modular cities and factories that learned from his vision. He had shown the world that greatness didn't come from perfection. It came from momentum, from movement, from daring, from the audacity to begin before the experts said you were ready. He used to say, "Start sooner than you're prepared to, and you'll discover what you're capable of." At the time, it sounded reckless. Now I understand it was genius. Because that's what he did in 1940. He started sooner than he should have, and by doing so, he forced the world to catch up. Every rivet replaced by a weld, every ship assembled in parallel rather than sequence, every untrained worker who became an expert in a month, all of it was a declaration of independence from the limits of tradition. The shipyards of Richmond, Portland, and Vancouver weren't just factories. They were schools of belief. And their graduates went on to rebuild the post-war world, laying railroads, erecting bridges, constructing the new America. They carried with them the unspoken law of Kaiser's creed. If it hasn't been done before, that's the best reason to do it. Sometimes, late at night, I return to the docks in my mind, to that moment when the Robert E. Peary broke free from her blocks and slid into the bay. The water roared up her sides, sunlight flashing off her hull, a symbol of defiance made tangible. The crowd erupted, and Kaiser, standing a little apart, smiled, not like a man celebrating triumph, but like one quietly confirming a truth he'd always known. That truth has followed me all my life. It is not about steel or welding or even war. It is about possibility, the moment when ordinary hands perform extraordinary acts because someone dared to believe they could. The world still builds Liberty ships, though not in name. Every time an engineer cuts construction time in half, every time a new worker masters a skill once thought beyond reach, every time a leader refuses to accept that's impossible, the spirit of Henry Kaiser flickers back to life. The years have dimmed much of what we built, but sometimes, walking along the quiet edge of the bay, I still hear the ghosts, the echo of cranes, the hum of engines, the laughter of welders, the thud of boots on catwalks, the song of steel being born. It reminds me that revolutions don't always arrive with banners or gunfire. Sometimes they come disguised as work sparks in the dark, hands steady on torches, and the simple belief that there must be a faster, better way. The world owes its modern heartbeat to that belief. The Liberty ships carried it across every ocean, and when they were gone, it remained in the minds of those who remembered how it felt to make the impossible real. And that's why I tell this story not as history, but as testimony. I saw a man who refused to accept the pace of the world, and in doing so, he changed it. I saw workers who began as strangers and left as symbols of what humanity could accomplish when organized by faith rather than fear. The Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes. But what she truly built was conviction, that limits are not laws, that expertise can be learned, and that the greatest revolutions begin not with grand plans, but with one person saying, "We can do better." The steel may rust, but the lesson endures, carved into every modern shipyard, whispered in every factory, alive in every builder who looks at the impossible and begins anyway. And so I end where I began, standing on the edge of that bay, watching the water catch the morning light. The cranes are gone now, but their shadows linger. And if I listen hard enough, I can still hear Henry Kaiser's voice carried by the wind, calm and certain as ever. We stopped asking permission from the past.